Perfect, another fraud. Someone like you could really get into SEAL training?
The young man's voice cut through the heavy air of the bar sharp as a blade. Sarah knew she could have walked away, but the contempt dripping from each word ignited memories of every sacrifice she had ever carried. Her blood turned cold, yet her eyes burned like fire. And from that moment on, the entire bar was swept into a storm. No one could have predicted a night that seemed ordinary would become the beginning of a story about honor, truth, and the price to be paid when a ghost finally stepped into the light. Sarah Chun, a black former naval officer, walked into Murphy's, wearing her deep navy blue dress uniform. The medals on her chest felt heavier than usual after the Veterans Day ceremony. The stiff fabric seemed out of place on a body long accustomed to the rhythms of civilian life. It had been 3 years since she left active duty, yet she still hadn't found a way to fit seamlessly into the world outside the military. That night, the bar was packed, half veterans brooding quietly over their beers, half college kids carrying on as if a Tuesday night were New Year's Eve. Sarah had only meant to stop in for a quick drink before heading back to her empty apartment. But old habits never died. Even in the crush of neon light and crowded bodies, she instinctively noted every exit, registered each potential threat, memorized the faces that might spell trouble. And sure enough, the first red flag was the group of young men clustered around the pool table, their laughter sharp and grating as alcohol fueled their bravado. She tried to tune them out, focusing instead on the amber swirl of her drink and the low murmur from the veterans' corner, the quiet ones who understood that some memories were better left buried. Then one voice rang out, tearing through the air. If I joined the military, I'd run the place in no time. 2 years of CrossFit and I'd have the drill instructors begging me for lessons. The others erupted in laughter, turning arrogance into a game. Sarah's jaw clenched, but she stayed silent. She knew from experience that arguing with drunks only made things worse. She was about to finish her drink and leave when their attention shifted toward a familiar face. In the corner, Tom Rodriguez. A former Marine, Tom had lost his leg to an IED in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. He usually kept to himself, sipping beer and watching the TV in silence. But tonight the students' mocking eyes landed squarely on him. Look at that Captain Hook, one of them sneered loud enough for the whole bar to hear. Must be nice collecting checks for doing nothing. The room fell silent, even the jukebox seeming to lower its voice. Sarah felt a cold knot tighten in her gut, that old battlefield instinct rising in her veins. Her steady hands, once trained for hours of firefights, now trembled faintly against the rim of her glass. Convenient, huh? The student pressed on. Lose a leg just in time to cash in. Probably a scam. Pretend to be a hero to milk the system. Tom kept his head down, staring into his bottle, but Sarah could see his shoulders stiffen, his grip tightening on the glass as though he might shatter it. This wasn't about the missing limb. It was the invisible wound no one dared touch. Sarah pushed back her chair, the scrape of wood against the floor echoing like a warning shot. Heads turned as the figure in dress blues walked straight toward the students, back straight chin lifted the medals on her chest, catching the light with each deliberate step. That man, Sarah's voice rang clear, lost his leg in Kandahar. He carried 2 wounded Marines out of a firefight before the mine went off. He could have saved himself, but he didn't leave his brothers behind. So show some respect. Her words sliced through the thick air, leaving the students stunned by a truth they had never even considered. The heckler smirked, but his bravado faltered. Great, another fake. What are you, a Navy SEAL? Maybe you served with Captain America. His taunt lingered like a spark in dry brush. Sarah knew she could walk away, but the icy contempt in his tone unlocked every memory of sacrifice, every loss she carried in silence. Her blood ran cold, but her eyes burned bright. Yes, Sarah answered, her voice low, but carrying like the crack of a rifle. The entire bar seemed to stop breathing. Phones lit up, cameras were raised. Everyone understood they were about to witness a moment that could never be erased. The students shifted uneasily, their bravado faltering into uncertainty. A woman can't be a SEAL. "That's stolen valor. We should call the cops right now," a voice shouted from the crowd, and soon a chant of fraud spread through the room. Cell phones rose like weapons, recording every second of Sarah standing motionless in the circle of jeers. Her military instincts urged her to find an escape route, but everywhere she turned were lenses and hostile eyes. The wail of sirens cut through the night, and moments later 2 officers stepped inside, hands hovering near their holsters. Sarah knew she could take them both down in seconds if she wanted, but her heart told her otherwise. Calmly, she placed her hands behind her back, letting them snap on the cuffs. The familiar warning, "You have the right to remain silent," was drowned out by boos and flashing cameras. As she walked through the parted crowd, Sarah no longer seemed a prisoner being led away, but a figure of defiance, an emblem of pride under siege. Before she was taken out, Sarah caught Tom Rodriguez's eyes. He raised his beer in a small gesture, a wordless salute only she would understand. Ironically, that fleeting acknowledgement would be the last respect she would receive for a long time. The paradox cut deep. For years she had sacrificed in silence, protecting people who would never know her name. And now those same people were tearing her down in broad daylight, turning her humiliation into entertainment for millions of screens. The cruiser door slammed shut, smothering the last breath of her freedom. Sarah Chun, once one of the most dangerous covert operators in the United States military, was now reduced to a viral video. To the public, she became the textbook case of a stolen valor fraud, a cautionary tale about lies with no one aware of the tattoo hidden beneath her sleeve that told a different story. In Washington, D.C., an admiral happened to glance at the news and froze. He knew immediately everything was about to change. The holding cell at Central Precinct reeked of disinfectant, its harsh sterility suffocating. Sarah sat on the bench, remembering the 72 hours she once spent hiding in Afghan caves, while Taliban fighters swept past only yards away. At least in combat, she had known who the enemy was. Here, surrounded by cold concrete and humming fluorescent lights, it felt as though the entire world had turned against her. Detective Maria Santos flipped open the file with practiced ease. After more than 23 years in the job, she'd seen her share of imposters, mostly middle-aged men hungry for glory that was never theirs. Their stories always unraveled after a few basic questions. She assumed Sarah Chun was no different except for being a woman of color, a statistical anomaly. Yet, the arrest video gave her pause. Most fakes wept or raged under pressure. Sarah, by contrast, had stood in the middle of a hostile crowd with cameras in her face and never once lost her composure. Her breathing was steady, her posture rigid, her eyes sweeping the room like she was running tactical assessments. That wasn't the behavior of a liar. That was the discipline of someone who had faced death more than once. The first interrogation unsettled Santis even more. The test questions that usually tripped imposters barely fazed her. When asked about Hell Week and SEAL training, Sarah didn't parrot movie cliches or headlines. She described the water temperature, about 58 degrees Fahrenheit, and the drills where instructors forced trainees to stay under until their vision narrowed to darkness. She recalled the tang of salt mixed with the smell of diesel on Coronado Beach, the crescent-shaped scar on instructor Kowalski's left hand, even the splinters from the massive training logs that jabbed under fingernails, pain sharper than the crushing weight itself. "Then tell me about your first mission," Santis pressed. Sarah's gaze drifted. "Helmand, 2018. We were ordered to break Taliban supply lines along the Pakistani border. Most of it took place in places that don't exist on maps, doing things no one will ever admit happened." Her tone was flat, but it carried the exhaustion of someone who had seen too much and stayed silent for too long. "What was your unit designation?" Santis asked. "I can't say. Can't or won't both." The detective shifted tactics. "What about your commanding officer?" Sarah hesitated, then answered, "Admiral James Morrison, call sign Hawk. Birthmark shaped like Texas on his right shoulder. Drinks his coffee black with exactly 2 spoons of sugar. Lost his wedding ring during an op in Syria, and the tan line still shows on his ring finger." Those details were far too personal, too obscure to be fabricated. Santis tried to verify, but every call to the Navy hit a wall. Lines transferred endlessly until she was told this request is outside standard procedure. Additional authorization required. A senior officer she begged for answers finally said, "There is no record of a Sarah Chun in the SEALs." Yet his voice was too stiff, too careful, and Santis's instincts screamed that something was being buried. Meanwhile, outside the station, the world was on fire. Within hours, #fake SEAL was trending globally. Sarah's mugshot, her calm face, her unflinching eyes, was shared millions of times, accompanied by cruel captions that grew nastier by the minute. Critics nitpicked everything her natural curls claimed to violate regulations. The order of her medals said to be incorrect. Her uniform called inappropriate for a bar. No one cared about truth. All they needed was prey to feed a collective fury. Sarah's family became targets. Her parents, who ran a small soul food restaurant in the black neighborhood, were doxxed their home address, and personal details splashed across the internet. Threats poured in. Protesters gathered outside, holding signs that read, "Fake Family," forcing the restaurant to shut down. Her father, a Vietnam veteran who had quietly buried his own memories of war, now had to bow his head under public shame. At the same time, Sarah's civilian job at a cybersecurity firm, her attempt to rebuild a normal life, was cut short with a single email. "Due to recent events and negative public attention, we are forced to terminate your contract effective immediately." In the holding cell, Sarah sat upright, hands laced together. Her poise was so commanding that no other inmate dared come near her. It was as if one wrong move would end them in an instant. And the truth was, she could. The second interrogation began with a very different energy. Detective Santis had spent the night combing through everything she could find on Black Ops and the shadow programs of the military. When her eyes met Sarah's across the table, she asked, "Do you know anything about Operation Silent Current?" For the first time since her arrest, Sarah slipped. It was slight, just the tightening at the corner of her eyes, a brief hitch in her breathing, but Santis caught it. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah replied, though her voice had shifted heavy with the weight of a secret too dangerous to name. The calm confidence drained from her, replaced with a steel-like guardedness. Santis leaned forward, voice low. "Joint Task Force Syria 2019, ring a bell." Sarah's hands, motionless through hours of questioning, trembled faintly, a fleeting crack in her iron discipline. Sarah Santis said, eyes locked on her, "I'm starting to believe you. And if I'm right, then someone with serious power wants you erased. The question is, why?" Before Sarah could answer, Santis's phone vibrated violently. A Pentagon official was already en route from Washington, D.C. Someone with clearance high enough to touch files Santis wasn't even sure existed on paper. The nightmare was about to get worse. Or better. And the possibility of the latter unsettled Sarah most of all. Because sometimes the truth was more dangerous than the lie. Outside the precinct, satellite trucks lined the street like vultures circling a carcass. What had started as a stolen valor scandal had spiraled into a broader storm, questions about truth, honor, and the cost of service in a world that crowned heroes one day and crushed them the next. In her cell, Sarah closed her eyes, reaching for the last memory of feeling safe 3 years ago in a debriefing room in Virginia, when Admiral Morrison shook her hand and said, "You can go home now." But she knew better. Home was a luxury for ghosts like her, those who lived only in redacted reports. At the Pentagon, Admiral James Hawk Morrison was reviewing casualty reports when Navy Lieutenant Jessica Park burst through the door, a breach of protocol so severe he instinctively reached for his sidearm. Park was shaken uniform, disheveled, clutching her tablet as if it contained launch codes. "Sir, you need to see this. In 32 years of service, 3 theaters of war, countless life-or-death calls that had carved deep scars into his soul, very little still surprised him. But when the video played showing a woman in dress blues being cuffed and led away as a fraud, his coffee cup slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. The face was older, harder, but unmistakable. Sarah Ghost Chun, the same woman who had once pulled his son's entire platoon out of an ambush in 2019, carrying 2 wounded Marines across more than 3 miles of hostile ground, while her own neck and shoulder bled from shrapnel. The woman who had looked him in the eye afterward and said, "Just doing my job, sir," as though she had delivered mail instead of working a miracle. Now Morrison watched and rewatched the footage of her surrounded by a jeering mob, phones raised like weapons, her body motionless in the storm. The bitter irony cut deep. This woman had more combat deployments and achievements than most battalions combined, yet she was being torn apart by the very people she had sworn to protect. "Prep the jet," he said flatly, voice like cracking ice. "Patch me through to Admiral Torres on a secure channel. Tell him it's about Ghost." The 3-hour flight gave him too much time to revisit classified files that officially didn't exist. 12 deployments across 4 countries. 47 confirmed enemy targets neutralized. 3 Purple Hearts that would never be acknowledged. 1 Medal of Honor nomination locked away until every witness was gone. But the most haunting entries weren't the numbers. It was the time Sarah refused medevac after shrapnel pierced her throat, determined to finish the mission. The care packages she bought out of pocket for fallen comrades' families. The fact she had never demanded recognition, never once complained, never believed the world owed her anything for the body and soul she left on foreign soil. His phone buzzed with fresh updates. Sarah's family, harassed and threatened, their address leaked, crowds forming outside their home. A woman who had once taken bullets for Americans was now hunted by those who had never tasted real fear. The jet landed, and Morrison went straight to the courthouse. Outside was chaos, news vans, barricades, protesters waving signs, transforming the hearing into a circus of cheap patriotism. In his immaculate white dress uniform, medals gleaming, he pushed through the crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea. In the hallway, he met Detective Santos, her face drawn, her eyes carrying the weight of someone who had glimpsed a world where truth was classified and heroes erased. "I'm Admiral Morrison. You've been trying to verify Sarah Chun's record." Santos looked at him like a drowning woman handed a lifeline. "Thank God. I've been stonewalled at every turn. The Navy swears there's no record, but it doesn't add up. She knows things no civilian could possibly know. That's because she's not a civilian," Morrison said quietly. "She's one of ours. And the storm we're in now, it started because of the work she did for this country." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Sarah was brought in for arraignment. Morrison's chest tightened when he saw her in the orange jumpsuit, wrists, shackled face, eerily calm. Then Sarah turned her head and time seemed to halt. Just above the collar of her prison garb was a small crescent-shaped scar about an inch long, jagged at the edges where twisted metal had ripped through flesh. He remembered holding the flashlight while a corpsman stitched that wound inside a shattered schoolhouse in Syria. He had seen her bite down on a strip of leather to keep from crying out. He had heard her refuse morphine because she needed to stay sharp until the extraction hours later. That scar wasn't an injury. It was the signature of courage. Morrison clenched his jaw and pushed past reporters to the prosecutor's table. "Counselor." His voice was low, sharp as a field order. "I need 1 minute." The prosecutor looked up, catching sight of the stars on his collar. "Admiral, I'm afraid this isn't." Morrison leaned close, his whisper carrying the weight of armor-piercing rounds. "The scar on her neck, I personally watched a corpsman stitch it under shell fire after she saved 12 American servicemen, including my son. She's real. And if you don't withdraw the charges in the next 60 seconds, I'll declassify just enough to not only end your career, but make you a national disgrace. Are we clear?" The prosecutor went pale. He looked around the cameras, the bloodthirsty crowd, the accused standing as still as if facing a firing squad. "Your Honor." His voice wavered. The prosecution requests a short recess to review newly presented evidence. But Morrison wasn't finished. He moved to Sarah's side. She lifted her gaze, eyes that had seen too much and spoken too little. For a heartbeat, years collapsed into a single moment. The ruined classroom in Syria, the smell of dust and smoke, the trembling beam of a flashlight, and a young soldier refusing to give up while her blood pooled on the floor. "Ghost," his eyes told her, "it's me. And this time, no one will tear you apart for doing the right thing." "Hello, Ghost," Morrison said softly, using her old call sign. The name broke her. The iron discipline she had worn for 3 years cracked, and tears streamed down her face, not only for fallen comrades, but for the missions that had taken everything from her and left nothing in the eyes of those she saved. They were tears for a life lived in shadows, so others could bask in light and glory. "Admiral," she choked out, "I didn't think anyone remembered." Morrison's own eyes blurred. "How could we forget you saved my son? You saved all of them." The courtroom fell silent, as if everyone realized they were witnessing something far beyond their understanding of heroism and sacrifice. Even the reporters who had come ready to film every second lowered their cameras, pulled into the raw truth unfolding before them. Morrison turned to the bench. "Your Honor, this woman is a decorated veteran. Her record is currently inaccessible because its classification level is beyond this court's authority. I stand here to vouch for her character and her service." The judge, a former Marine himself, knew the weight of those words. "Are you stating that the charges against Miss Chun are baseless?" Morrison's voice thundered. "I'm stating that Sarah Chun served this country with a level of honor that surpasses lifetimes. The only falsehood in her life is the civilian disguise she was forced to wear when she left the service." He looked back at Sarah, his voice carrying across the chamber. "The President wants to meet you. A ceremony is being prepared. The world deserves the truth." Sarah shook her head, the same fire in her eyes that had once made her refuse evacuation. "I didn't do it for glory. I did it because it was the right thing to do." Morrison smiled through tears. "That's exactly why you deserve it." Outside, the crowd that had gathered to witness a stolen valor trial now saw something entirely different. A ghost stepping into the light. But for Sarah, vindication was only the beginning. The hardest part would be learning to live as a normal person again, knowing there were losses that would never be repaid, sacrifices that could never be fully honored. 6 weeks later, the courthouse was overflowing. What had started as a simple fraud case had turned into a public event, unlike anything seen before, fragments of truth leaking out about missions that had quietly shaped modern history. Every seat was filled with reporters, veterans, military officials, and civilians eager to witness history in the making. Sarah sat at the defense table, no longer in orange, but in a simple black suit, exuding a danger more potent than any uniform. At her side was David Chen, former JAG officer. Once skeptical, he now understood he was representing someone who lived at the edge of legend and reality. Judge Patricia Hawkins, who had served 2 tours in Iraq, banged her gavel to open the session. The past month had been filled with legal battles, security vetting, and negotiations over what could be revealed. The Pentagon wanted silence, but Morrison had fought to ensure at least part of the truth reached daylight because Sarah deserved nothing less than public vindication. When he took the witness stand, his white dress uniform gleaming chest heavy with medals, his voice filled the chamber with the force of a battlefield command. "I stand here not only as an Admiral of the United States Navy, but as a father whose son came home because of that woman," Morrison began. The courtroom held its breath. "I cannot reveal details of Operation Silent Current because its classification is beyond this court's authority. But I can tell you this: in the summer of 2019, a joint task force was trapped deep in Syrian territory. 12 American servicemen, including my son, were left with almost no chance of survival. We had already begun preparing their casualty reports." His voice trembled, but his eyes burned with conviction. Sarah Chun, callsign Ghost, volunteered for an extraction every tactical expert deemed impossible. Sarah lowered her head, her hands trembling. She had never heard Morrison recount the story from his perspective. He continued slowly. "She walked 18 miles through enemy territory, found the unit when several were unconscious and others gravely wounded. The extraction point was 3 miles away, enemy patrols everywhere. Any other person would have left the critically injured behind to save the rest, but Sarah carried them all 4 trips until every last man was safe." Morrison's voice hardened, choked with emotion. "On the final trip, she was hit by shrapnel, missing her carotid artery by less than half an inch. But she refused medevac until every one of them was on the helicopter. When I asked why, she simply said, 'Because they're Americans, sir.'" A chorus of muffled sobs echoed around the chamber. The image of Sarah transformed before them, once branded a fraud, now revealed as a hero beyond imagination. He lowered his voice, eyes shining with pride. The only false thing about Sarah Chun is the civilian mask she was forced to wear. The truth is that she lived, fought, and sacrificed in ways most of us could never endure. The courtroom sank into silence, then broke with tears. Even hardened reporters stopped writing. What began as a stolen valor trial had turned into a public epic of heroism, and Sarah, once cursed online, now stood revealed as the ghost who had shielded a generation of American soldiers. "Hello, Ghost," Morrison whispered, using her old call sign. Sarah broke the tears she had damned for 3 years, finally bursting free. Tears for comrades who never came home. Tears for missions that had taken everything but left her nothing in return. Tears for herself, a woman who had lived in shadows so others could stand in the light. "Admiral, I never thought anyone remembered." Morrison's own voice cracked. "How could we forget you saved my son? You saved them all." The courtroom stilled, reverent, as if they stood on sacred ground. Even photographers lowered their cameras, realizing they were witnessing something more profound than politics or war. Morrison turned toward the bench. "This woman is a decorated veteran. Her record is not hidden because of fraud, but because the truth is too sensitive. She took part in missions that will never appear in official logs, protecting people who will never know her name." His voice rose. "She gave her youth her peace, her very chance at a normal life in service to this nation. And how did we repay her? By arresting her in a bar, branding her a fraud, dragging her honor through the mud because a drunk college kid couldn't show respect to a wounded veteran." Applause erupted, but Morrison pressed on. He opened a folder stamped "Top Secret." His tone solemn. "I hold here presidential authorization to partially declassify her record. With the court's permission, I'll read a summary." He began Sarah Chun, United States Navy. 12 deployments across 4 theaters. 47 confirmed enemy combatants neutralized. 3 successful hostage rescues. 2 domestic terror plots disrupted. 7 combat wounds, 4 refusals of evacuation. Twice nominated for the Medal of Honor, but classified for security reasons. Morrison closed the folder and swept his gaze across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, before you stands a living legend. A ghost who walked through hell to preserve your freedom and never once asked for thanks." The judge immediately dismissed all charges. But true vindication came when Sarah stepped out of the courthouse. The same crowd that had screamed for her blood 6 weeks earlier now shouted her name in triumph. Veterans stood at attention saluting. Strangers reached for her hands, eyes shining with gratitude. On the courthouse steps stood Brandon Matthews, the college student whose insult had sparked the nightmare. His face was streaked with tears after weeks of volunteering at a VA hospital to learn what service truly meant. "Ma'am, he stammered, as Sarah stopped him with a cold stare. Don't apologize to me. Apologize to Tom Rodriguez. Apologize to every veteran you ever disrespected. Apologize to the families of those who died so you could act like a foolish kid in a bar." Brandon nodded, understanding at last that some mistakes can never be undone with words. Morrison caught up to Sarah at the foot of the steps. "The president wants to meet you. There will be a full honor ceremony." Sarah shook her head, her eyes fierce. "I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because it had to be done." Morrison smiled through tears. "That's exactly why you deserve it." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the White House Rose Garden, wearing the same deep navy dress uniform she had on the night she was arrested at Murphy's Bar. The President of the United States draped the Presidential Medal of Freedom around her neck. The citation was brief, vague due to classification, but for those who knew it, held an entire epic within it. Sarah Chun embodies the highest ideals of service and sacrifice. Her actions saved countless American lives and protected our nation's security in ways that may never be fully known. Among the hundreds of guests, Sarah's eyes found the small group at the back, Tom Rodriguez, and a handful of veterans who had been there that night. They were the ones who understood that heroism was not found in ceremony or spotlight, but in doing what was right, no matter the cost. After the event, reporters swarmed, asking about her plans, her feelings, the meaning of it all. Sarah answered politely, briefly. Her mind was already elsewhere toward the life ahead. That evening, in her small apartment, the metal gleamed on the coffee table as she read a message. "Proud of you, Ghost. Welcome home. Morrison." And for the first time in 3 years, Sarah smiled. She understood then coming home wasn't about ceremony or honors. It was about learning to walk in the light while staying true to who she was. The woman once arrested for faking heroism was now honored for what she had always been. But more importantly, Sarah Chun realized that being a hero was never about titles. It was about the willingness to serve, to sacrifice, to stand for what is right, even when the world waits for you to fall. Outside her window, the city pulsed with ordinary life. Millions protected by unseen guardians. Sarah had once been one of them, and now she had become something rarer still, a ghost who had found her way back among the living. The nightmare was over. Her real life, where she could be Sarah Chun and Ghost, both ordinary and extraordinary, was only just beginning. If Sarah Chun's story moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next powerful story. And please share your thoughts in the comments below. What does true heroism mean to you? We'd love to hear your voice.